Hey guys, Dr. McClellan here. I sure have missed seeing you all in the classroom. You know, these days we're being asked, even forced, to sacrifice a lot of the things we love. We can't watch sports, we can't go to the movies, we can't even go out to eat with our friends. And sadly, millions of people are losing their jobs. All of this sacrifice is being made in the interest of saving lives from the coronavirus. But did you know that you and I, under normal circumstances, could have been sacrificing things we enjoy to save lives?
Consider malaria, for example. It kills about 400,000 people every year, mostly in developing African nations, with the vast majority of those deaths happening to children under 5 years old. One way to prevent kids from contracting malaria is to have them sleep under insecticide-laced nets that prevent mosquitoes from biting. That's the mission of the Against Malaria Foundation, who claims that for a donation of only $2, a net will be produced and distributed on your behalf. So when you think about it, whenever you spent money on something you didn't need, you could have been helping prevent malaria. Those concert tickets you paid $100 each for? Yeah, that could have been 100 nets.
I make unnecessary purchases all the time. Last summer, I actually bought an extra car. Now, you guys know about my trusty Hyundai Sonata I've had since 2005. Remember, it's my very own ship of Theseus. Well, I actually really like sports cars. I've just never wanted to spend the money to own one. Last summer, I finally got something. Let's go take a look. 1999 Toyota Celica. Okay, so it's not a Corvette, but it only cost me $3,000, and it is a lot of fun to drive. Plus, it did get pretty good reviews when it came out.
Looks may not be everything, but that didn't stop the designers of the new Toyota Celica from producing a striking automobile. Toyota planned the new Celica to please the car's most loyal customers, young, predominantly female buyers.
Wait, what? Well, Scotty Kilmer likes it anyway. Let's take it for a spin. Let's put some music in the old Logic control deck. Here's Journey. Got Stryper and some Wham. Thanks a lot, Dr. Baldridge, for loaning these to me. It's the Billboard #1 song of 1999. Well, that's fitting.
Do you believe in life after love?
Now, here's the Billboard #1 rock song of 1999. Let's try that. All right.
Sky tissue that I wish you saw. Sarcastic Mr. Know-It-All. I'll close your eyes and I'll kiss you, 'cause with the birds I'll share. With the birds I'll share this lonely view. And with the birds I'll share this lonely view. And push me up against the wall. Young tuck girl in a push-up bra. I'm falling all over myself to lick your heart and taste your heel. 'Cause with the birds I share this lonely view. And with the birds I share this lonely view. And with the birds I share this lonely view. Blood loss in a bathroom stall. A southern girl with the sky.
$3,000 is pretty cheap for a car. Remember, I didn't even need a car. I just bought this for fun. And it is a little more than $3,000 because I had to register it, pay taxes, insurance. Had to replace a few parts. So really, it cost me, let's say, $4,000. Now, I could have taken that same $4,000 and donated it to some charity that helps people in developing nations. Like, had I sent it to the Against Malaria Foundation, $4,000, that would have supplied about
2,000 nets.
And since each one of those nets, on average, protects 2 people, I could have used that money to protect
4,000.
people from malaria. but I chose the car. Now, of course, it's not like all
4,000.
of those people have actually contracted and died from malaria. But even on conservative estimates, $4,000 donation is enough to likely prevent one death from malaria, not to mention many cases of non-fatal malaria. But again, I chose the car. So that raises the question, was it immoral for me to buy a car that I enjoy? Did I just choose a frivolous material thing over human life? I first heard about this question when I was in college, and I had to read Peter Singer's essay. He argues that it's clearly immoral to spend your excess resources on frivolous things you don't need when there are people in such desperate need. And he supports his argument with a really provocative argument from analogy. Now, we've been learning about arguments from analogy in Philosophy 101, and Peter Singer's is a really terrific one. It's about a drowning child. But here, I'll just let him tell you about it.
So we're outside Bergdorf Goodman, where they've got a display of Dolce & Gabbana shoes. And it's kind of amusing to me because about 30 years ago, I wrote an article called Famine, Affluence and Morality, in which I imagined that you're walking past a shallow pond, and as you walk past it, you notice that there's a small child who's fallen into the pond and seems to be in danger of drowning. And you look around to see where the parents are, and there's nobody in sight. You realize that unless you wade into this pond and pull the child out, the child is likely to drown. There's no danger to you because you know the pond is just a shallow one, but you are wearing a nice pair of shoes, and they're probably going to get ruined if you wade into that shallow pond. So, of course, when I ask people this, they always say, well, of course, forget about the shoes. You've just got to save the child. That's clear. And then I stop and say, okay, well, I agree with you about that. But for the price of a pair of shoes, if you were to give that to Oxfam or UNICEF or one of those organizations, they could probably save the life of a child, maybe more than one child, in a poor country.
Now, most of us, when we hear this argument, we think there's just got to be something wrong with it. As I explained to you guys before, the way to critique an argument from analogy is to look for some sort of significant difference between the two cases being compared. And I hate we can't do that together in class discussion like I normally would. So let me share with you 3 attempts that students commonly make to critique Singer's analogy.
Okay, first let's get a few visual aids in place. There's our pond, and here's our drowning child. And now here I come strolling through the field in my new fancy clothes. If you want, you can imagine it's a $4,000 wardrobe. So it's decision time. Protect my new clothes or save the child. What should I do? Now let's get something out of the way real quick, because there's always some wise guy in my class who says, well, why don't you just take your clothes off and then save the child? Look, first of all, I don't really think it's appropriate to undress in front of a child. The second, come on man, just go with it. I mean, if you have to, imagine my shoes are laced up super tight and my pants are real form-fitting and leather. So there's just no time to shimmy out of them. It's the clothes or the kid, that's it. Now it's obvious that I ought to sacrifice those clothes and save the child. As I said, I want to discuss 3 attempts from my former students to identify a relevant difference between this drowning child scenario and the donating money scenario. The first difference is the fact that I know I can save that drowning child. I mean, look at him. He's close, he's small, the pond is shallow. Sure, I'm going to have to mess up my new clothes, but at least I know I'll be saving a life. On the other hand, if I had chosen to donate my $4,000 to some organization, I couldn't be sure they'd actually save anyone with my money, right? Now that's an interesting difference, but is it a relevant difference? Well, we can test for that. All we have to do is alter this drowning child scene so there's no longer any guarantee my sacrifice would save him. And that's easy to do. Let's just imagine that he'd already been in the water a while before I got there. he's already turned blue, and things aren't looking good. So what should I do now? Would it be okay for me to stand on the shore protecting my fancy clothes, since there's no longer a guarantee that I'll actually be able to save him? Of course not. I'll have to rush in and try to save him. Well, that suggests that the mere lack of a guarantee that my sacrifice would pay off when I donate money is pretty irrelevant. The second difference is the fact that in the drowning child case, it's up to me in particular to save the child, whereas there are lots of people besides me that could sacrifice on behalf of folks in developing nations. Is that a relevant difference? Well, here again we can run a pretty simple test. All we have to do is imagine that I'm not the only one who can save the drowning child. So let's imagine that this guy happened to walk up on the scene, and he's wearing his own fancy clothes. Yeah, I realize we look like a couple of Mormon missionaries. And just for good measure, let's imagine that there's a third person who walks up in his fancy clothes. The question is, what should I do? Yeah, there are two people besides me who could help the child. Would that make it okay for me to just stand there and protect my clothes? I don't think so, especially if we imagine that these other two guys aren't going to get the job done. The fact is, a kid is drowning and I ought to help. So even though there are other people besides me who could donate their resources to save desperate people, that doesn't really seem relevant to what I should do. The third difference I want to cover is related to that second one. Some of my students have wisely pointed out that it's not just the fact that other people besides me could help people in developing nations. It's that there are some people who have special responsibilities to care for those people that I don't have. For example, you might think it's the responsibility of the adults within those nations to better care for their neighbors. Or maybe you think it's the responsibility of the governments to better care for their own citizens. Or you might think it's the responsibility of billionaires and millionaires in affluent nations, and not ordinary folks like you and me, to fund life-saving efforts abroad. Isn't that a relevant difference between me donating money and saving the drowning child? Well, all we have to do is imagine that those other two fellows on the screen have special responsibilities to the drowning child that I don't have. So let's imagine that the guy at the top is actually the child's father, and the guy on the left is actually a trained and certified lifeguard. No, I can't do that to him. There you go, Soviet. That's what hitting the weights a little bit could do for you. So now we have two people who are clearly more responsible for this child's well-being than I am. So what should I do now? Well, it sort of depends on what they do, right? I mean, suppose the kid's dad would really like to help, but he's just unable to for some reason. I don't know, maybe his legs quit working. And maybe that lifeguard is just a bad guy who doesn't really care.
Bye, Felicia!
So what should I do now? Would it be okay for me to protect my own clothes on the basis that those other people were more responsible for this kid than me? I don't think so. So here again, it looks like we're dealing with a pretty irrelevant difference.
So as you can see, Singer's analogy's pretty strong. But that doesn't mean it's foolproof. So feel free to leave a comment below if you've got an idea of how to challenge it, or if you want to discuss anything I've said in this video. In the meantime, I'm going to enjoy the ride.